The moment Marcus Vane stepped onto Blackthorn Ranch, he did not knock. He walked through the gate like a man who already owned everything behind it, his lawyers trailing him in pressed suits, carrying leather satchels thick with papers. He found Nathaniel Cross standing near the corral fence and smiled the way men smile when they believe they've already won. "Sign these today," Marcus said, holding out a document without preamble, "and I'll let you keep the house." The ranch hands nearby went quiet. One of them, old Pete Garfield, who'd worked Blackthorn for 19 years, took a step forward and then stopped himself, jaw tight, eyes moving to Nathaniel's face. Nathaniel didn't take the papers. Marcus dropped them in the dirt at his feet. "Pick them up when you're ready," he said. "You've got until Friday." If you've ever watched someone try to take everything a person has built, everything they bled for, and treat it like it's already theirs, then you already know what that silence felt like. This is the story of what happened next. Of the woman nobody expected, of the ranch that nearly died, and the fight that brought it back from the edge. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and follow it all the way to the end, because what Clara Whitmore did next is something I don't want you to miss. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore did not arrive at Blackthorn Valley Ranch on a good day. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the morning air had that particular chill that sat in your teeth and wouldn't leave no matter how many times you swallowed. The freight wagon that carried her from the Mill Haven depot dropped her at the end of the ranch road without ceremony. The driver had 3 more stops and no interest in pleasantries, and she stood there for a moment with her travel bag at her feet and looked at what stretched before her. The ranch was large. Even from the gate you could see that it had once been something that made people stop talking mid-sentence. The main house sat back from the road at the end of a long straight path lined with fence posts, most of them solid, a few leaning at angles that suggested no one had gotten around to resetting them. Beyond the house, the outbuildings extended in a rough arc. A bunkhouse, a large barn, a smithy, and what looked like a storage building with half its roof replaced in newer lumber that hadn't weathered yet, the patching visible from a distance the way a scar is visible on pale skin. She picked up her bag and walked toward it. The gate was unlocked. She pushed through without hesitating, which some of the men watching from the bunkhouse doorway would later say was the first thing they noticed about her. Most visitors stopped at the gate and looked around waiting for someone to come out. Clara Whitmore walked in as if she'd been given permission by someone more authoritative than whoever might be watching. She had, in a manner of speaking, she had a letter. The letter was from a man named Hector Dills, who ran the labor office in Mill Haven and who had connections to ranches across the entire valley. Hector had written to Nathaniel Cross 3 weeks earlier, suggesting Clara as a ranch cook, and Nathaniel had written back a single line: "Send her if she's willing to come." Hector had shown Clara the reply, and she'd read that line twice, hearing in it everything it didn't say. A man who wrote like that was not excited. He was not hopeful. He was going through emotion. That was fine. Clara had spent most of her adult life dealing with people who were going through motions. She knocked on the main house door and waited. Nothing. She knocked again. Footsteps. Slow, not hurried. The footsteps of someone who wasn't particularly interested in reaching the door. When it opened, a heavy-set man with a gray vest and a pipe tucked into his shirt pocket squinted at her from the interior dimness. "I'm here about the cook position," Clara said. "I have a letter from Hector Dills." The man, she would learn his name was Gus Tremaine, the ranch's general hand manager, looked at the letter, looked at her, and stepped back without a word to let her in. The interior of the house was not what the exterior suggested. Outside, despite the neglected fences, there was still a sense of scale and investment, the bones of something deliberately constructed. Inside, it felt like someone had stopped caring about it all at once, the way houses do when the person who loved them most leaves and no one picks up where they left off. The kitchen sat at the back of the main floor, and when Gus opened that door and gestured for her to go in, Clara stepped through and stood very still for a moment. The shelves were largely bare. There was a good cast iron stove, heavy and serviceable, but the firebox hadn't been properly cleaned, and there was old grease built up along the front edge that someone had wiped at half-heartedly. The pantry door stood open, showing a collection of dried beans, some salt, a nearly empty sack of flour, and 3 jars of preserved tomatoes that had been sitting long enough that the lids had started to rust at the edges. The work table in the center of the room had a crack down one side that had been stuffed with a folded piece of cloth. The cloth had turned gray. "How many am I cooking for?" Clara asked. 11, most days. 14 when we've got extra hands come in. "What's the supply situation?" Gus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're looking at it." Clara turned and looked at the shelves again, more carefully this time. Not with dismay, but with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. She opened a drawer and found it stocked with serviceable kitchen tools, all of them dull or rusted to varying degrees. She opened the stove's firebox and checked the state of it, pulled her hand back, looked at her fingers. "I need a wire brush," she said. "A proper one. I'll see what we have in the... And I need to speak with Mr. Cross before I start. I want to know what he expects and what's actually possible, because right now those two things may not be the same." Gus Tremaine looked at her with an expression that suggested he'd been around long enough to find that kind of directness either refreshing or exhausting, and he hadn't yet decided which. He led her back through the house and up a staircase to a door at the end of a short hallway, knocked twice, and stepped aside. "New cook," he said through the door. "Says she wants to talk to you." A pause. Then, "Fine." Nathaniel Cross was sitting at a desk by the window when Clara came in, and he didn't look up immediately. He was a man in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who'd done physical work for decades, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had weathered into something you couldn't easily read. He was looking at a ledger, or appearing to look at one. Clara stood just inside the doorway and waited. After a moment, he looked up. He had dark eyes, not unfriendly, but not warm either. The eyes of someone who had learned to withhold things. "You're Clara Whitmore." "Yes." "Hector says you've cooked in 2 other ranches." "3. The Alderman place outside of Crestview for 8 months, the Pullman Road Station for a year and a half, and a smaller outfit down near the Reeves Creek area for about 6 months before they closed up." "Why'd you leave Pullman Road?" The question was blunt. Clara had been asked it before and had learned there were 2 ways to answer it: the careful way that made people comfortable, and the honest way. She'd noticed that people who asked bluntly usually responded better to honest. "The owner's son came back from the East and decided he wanted to run things differently," she said. "He wanted to cut the food budget by 1/3 and expected the same results. I told him that wasn't how arithmetic worked. He didn't enjoy hearing that." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Not a smile. More like the brief acknowledgement of something that might someday become one. "The kitchen needs work," Clara continued. "The pantry is nearly empty and what's there isn't organized in a way that helps anyone. I'd like a supply order within the first week. Not extravagant, but what's needed to actually feed people properly. I'd also like to know if there's a kitchen garden anywhere on the property and if it's been maintained." "There was one," Nathaniel said, "behind the east wing. Margaret, my wife, she kept it. It's been a while." He said it flatly, the way people say things they've said enough times that the words have been worn smooth, whatever feeling originally attached to them rubbed off through repetition. "I'd like to look at it," Clara said. He nodded once, which she took as permission. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Hector's letter said you're good in hard situations." Clara looked back at him. "That's what he said?" "More or less." "I've never had an easy situation to compare it to," she said, "so I wouldn't know the difference." She left him with that and went back to the kitchen. The first 3 days were what Clara privately thought of as the establishment period, the time during which she was not yet trusted but was being assessed, and during which she was simultaneously assessing everything around her. The ranch hands ate what she put in front of them, with the cautious expressions of men who had been disappointed enough times to have learned not to form opinions too quickly. They were not unkind. They were reserved, which was different. Pete Garfield was the exception. I was 62, had worked Blackthorn since before Nathaniel's wife had died, and had enough seniority that he felt entitled to opinions. He came into the kitchen on Clara's second morning before anyone else was up, found her already at the stove with the firebox cleaned and burning properly, and stood in the doorway for a long moment. "You're up early," he said. "Bread doesn't rise itself." He sat down at the work table without being invited, which Clara noted and did not comment on. She was learning that the work table was the informal center of the kitchen's social life, the place where people came when they needed to be near something human. Last two cooks lasted 3 weeks and 5 weeks, Pete said. Why'd they leave? First one couldn't stand the silence. Second one couldn't stand Mr. Cross. What about him couldn't she stand? Pete was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding how honest to be with a stranger. He wasn't cruel to her, nothing like that. He goes days sometimes without speaking to anyone. Just sits in that office with the ledger and the curtains half closed. Some people can take that and some people can't. She was the kind who needed a little acknowledgement now and then. He didn't have any left to give. Clara pulled the first loaf from the oven and set it on the rack. The kitchen filled with the smell of it, warm and immediate. What happened to his wife? She asked, because it was the question that mattered, and there was no tactful way around it. Fever. 5 years ago, give or take. She was the kind of person who held a place together just by being in it, if you know what I mean. After she went, everything sort of drifted. He picked up a piece of the previous day's bread she'd left out and turned it in his hands. This is better than what we've been getting. That was yesterday's, she said. Today's will be better. He almost smiled. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was transformed in the ways that mattered. The shelves were organized. The pantry had been supplemented with a careful supply order that Clara had written out, priced, and presented to Gus Tremaine with a note explaining each item and why it was worth the cost. Gus had looked at it for a long time and then approved it without changing anything, which told her something about him. That he was a man who respected a reasoned argument when he saw one. The garden behind the east wing was worse than abandoned. It was a tangle of dead stems and encroaching grass, 3 seasons of neglect visible in the way the beds had blurred back into the surrounding ground. But Clara could see the bones of it, the raised beds, the stone path down the center, the old trellis frame leaning but still standing. She spent an hour with a pair of heavy gloves pulling at the worst of the dead growth, then stood back and looked at what remained. There was still garlic. It had gone feral at the edges of one bed, spreading in the careless way of plants that don't need tending, small green shoots pushing up between the dead stalks of other things. She pulled a bulb loose from the soil and looked at it, then at the rest of the garden. She'd worked with less. That evening, for the first time, Nathaniel Cross came down to the dining room for supper. This was, according to Pete Garfield, unusual. For the past year, Nathaniel had taken his meals in the office. The fact that he appeared in the doorway of the dining room while the hands were still sitting at the table caused a noticeable shift in the room's atmosphere. Backs straightening, conversations pausing. He sat at the head of the table with the slightly stiff posture of someone not entirely comfortable in a chair they once occupied easily, and he ate without much comment, but he ate. Clara served from the kitchen and did not make a production of his presence. She put the food on the table and went back to her work. After the men had cleared out, Pete appeared at the kitchen door. He ate 2 full plates, he said. People eat when the food is worth eating, Clara said. It's not just the food. She looked up at him. The room smells like a room again, he said. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but you've had the windows open and you've got the stove going proper, and it just smells like somewhere people live. It's been a while since it smelled like that. Clara rinsed the pot she was holding and set it aside. Tell me about Marcus Vane, she said. The silence that followed was different from Pete's earlier silences. This one had weight. Where'd you hear that name? I was walking back from the supply wagon this afternoon and I heard Gus talking to one of the newer hands. They stopped when they saw me, which usually means the conversation isn't one people want overheard. Pete came into the kitchen and sat down at the work table. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who'd worked through enough seasons that his opinions had been shaped by evidence rather than feeling. Marcus Vane owns the Vane Consolidated Land Operation, he said. He started small, maybe 10 years ago. Bought out ranches that were struggling, combined them, expanded. He's got something like 4 or 5 properties now across the valley. Runs cattle, runs sheep on the southern ones, rents grazing land. He's rich in the way that makes people careful around him. Has he approached Nathaniel? Started coming around about 3 months ago. Friendly visits, he calls them. Talks about partnerships, about how 2 operations working together are stronger than one alone. Nathaniel listens because he's too tired to tell him to leave and too proud to admit he's worried. What does Vane actually want? Pete looked at her. Blackthorn sits at the top of the Callaway Creek watershed. You control the top of that watershed, you control the water for every ranch and farm downstream. Vane's got operations on 3 of those downstream properties. Right now, he has to negotiate water access with Nathaniel's foreman every season, and sometimes the negotiations don't go his way. If he owned Blackthorn, he'd control the water, Clara said. He'd control everything. Clara dried her hands on her apron and looked at the wall for a moment. This was something she did when she was thinking, went still, looked at a neutral point, let the information arrange itself. Does Nathaniel understand what Vane is actually after? I don't know what Nathaniel understands anymore, Pete said. 6 months ago, I would have said he's one of the sharpest men I've ever worked for. Now, he shook his head. He's been closed up so long I can't tell what's going on in there. That night Clara lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the quiet. The occasional shift of cattle far off, the wind working at the loose board on the barn she'd noticed, and added to her mental list of things that needed doing. She was not a woman who worried in the conventional sense, which was to say she didn't lie awake feeding anxiety. She lay awake assembling information. What she knew, Nathaniel Cross owned something valuable, and he was too hollowed out by grief to defend it properly. What she suspected, Marcus Vane was not making friendly visits. What she needed, a clearer picture of the threat before she decided what to do about it. Because she had decided one thing, lying there in the room above the kitchen with the wind moving outside. She had come to Blackthorn Ranch to cook. But cooking happened inside a place, and a place was only worth working in if it continued to exist. She intended to make sure it did. Over the following 2 weeks, Clara paid attention the way she had learned to pay attention. Not obviously, not with questions that announced themselves, but with the patient accumulation of small observations. She noticed that Marcus Vane's third friendly visit coincided with a county records clerk named Fowler passing through the valley on what Gus described as a survey job. She noticed that the survey job appeared to be concentrated on the northern boundary of Blackthorn land, specifically around the creek bed where the Callaway watershed fed into the ranch's upper pasture. She noticed that Fowler spent 3 days on that survey and billed it to a company called Valley Improvement Partners, which was a name she'd seen on one of the papers Gus had left, sitting out in the office alcove while he was dealing with a fence crew issue. She had not looked at those papers deliberately. She had simply seen the name in the course of moving through the space that was her kitchen, and names, once seen, stayed with her. She asked Pete who ran Valley Improvement Partners. Pete didn't know the name. She asked him to find out. He came back the next evening with the kind of expression that meant the information was worse than expected. Vane, he said, incorporated separately, but it's his. Clara was quiet for a moment. He's surveying land he doesn't own yet, she said. That's one way of looking at it. What's the other way? He's preparing documents to claim the survey establishes a boundary dispute, which would let him file a water rights challenge. If the challenge goes through, it freezes the water access agreements and Nathaniel has to litigate the whole thing. That costs money and time, and Vane's betting Nathaniel doesn't have enough of either to fight it. Clara turned back to the stove. She stirred what was in the pot without seeing it. Nathaniel had come down to dinner every night for the past 10 days. He'd started speaking during meals. Not much, not with any great warmth, but he asked the hands questions about the cattle and the fencing and the daily state of things, and he listened to the answers. Clara heard all of this through the open serving door and said nothing about it. She simply kept the food coming and the kitchen running. He came in one morning while she was in the early stages of organizing the week's cooking plan, a piece of paper in his hand. He set it on the work table and she looked at it. A letter from a law firm in the county seat, formal in language, referencing a survey conducted by Valley Improvement Partners and citing a potential boundary discrepancy affecting water access along the northern Callaway feed. Arrived this morning, he said. Clara read it twice. When was your original water rights agreement filed? 18 years ago, before I bought the property. Part of the original deed. And the survey that established the boundary? Same time. My father's generation, before the ranch transferred to me. Do you have the original survey documents? He looked at her. Somewhere. The deed papers are in the office. I need to see them, Clara said. All of them. The deed, the original survey, the water rights filing, anything attached to the property title from the time of purchase. Nathaniel Cross was a man who had spent 5 years being managed by his grief into a posture of quiet tolerance. People brought him problems. He listened. Things were handled or not handled, and life moved forward without much input from him. He was not accustomed to the feeling of someone asking him for something that required him to actually do a thing, and doing it with a specificity that made the request hard to deflect. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a cook," he said. Not unkindly, more like a man reminding himself of a fact. "I'm a cook who grew up watching my father lose his livelihood to a bad land agreement because he didn't understand what was in the papers he'd signed," Clara said. "I know what Valley Improvement Partners is. I know what this letter is the beginning of. And you need those original documents before this gets further along." She went back to her work. She could feel him standing there, and she gave him the space of not looking at him, because there are moments when a person needs to absorb something without being watched. She heard him leave. Then, 20 minutes later, she heard him come back. She turned, and he was in the doorway holding a wooden box she hadn't seen before, the kind that documents were kept in when someone intended them to be kept for a long time. He set it on the work table. "All of it's in here," he said. Clara wiped her hands and opened the box. The documents inside were old but intact, dry, carefully folded, the ink slightly faded but entirely legible. The original deed, the survey plat with handwritten boundary notes, the water rights agreement bearing the county seal, and several supplemental filings she'd need to read carefully. She spread them on the work table with the methodical attention of someone who has learned not to rush a thing that matters. Nathaniel watched her for a moment. "Why do you care?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Clara didn't look up from the documents. "Because this is a good place," she said. "Because the people who work here are worth something. Because someone built all of this through work that deserved to last. And I don't think you should lose it to a man who's never built anything except schemes for taking what other people built." She smoothed one of the survey documents flat with both hands. "And because I've been here 3 weeks," she said, "and I already know this place matters. Some things you just know." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "You'd better look at those carefully," he said finally. "Tell me what you find." He left her to it, and Clara Whitmore sat down at the cracked work table in the kitchen of Blackthorn Valley Ranch and began to read. She read through the night. Not all of it, because the documents were more numerous than she'd expected. The wooden box had contained not just the primary deed and survey, but a full accordion of supplemental filings, correspondence between the original owners and the county land office, and 2 handwritten ledgers that appeared to record every water usage agreement made on the property going back to its first year of operation. Clara worked through the primary documents first, making notes on a piece of paper she'd torn from the back of the kitchen supply ledger, then moved to the supplemental filings with the same systematic attention she brought to anything that mattered. By 2 in the morning, she had a clear enough picture that she could feel the shape of what Marcus Vane was doing, and the feeling was not good. The original survey of Blackthorn's northern boundary had been conducted by a county surveyor named Aldous Price in the year of the ranch's founding. Price had used the Callaway Creek centerline as the boundary marker, which was a standard practice for properties of that era and region. Natural features made for stable references, things that didn't move and couldn't be argued with. The water rights agreement derived from that boundary, establishing Blackthorn's right to draw from the Upper Callaway watershed as a function of the property's position relative to it. What Valley Improvement Partners' survey appeared to claim was that the Callaway Creek centerline had shifted over the 18 years since Price's work. Natural erosion, seasonal flooding, the slow migration of a waterway that had moved, they claimed, approximately 40 feet to the east. If true, that shift would place the boundary on the far side of a small but significant section of upper pasture, and the water rights agreement attached to that section would become legally ambiguous. Legally ambiguous, in Clara's experience, meant legally contested, which meant money, lawyers, and time. She understood immediately that the shift itself might even be real. Creek beds did move, and 40 feet over 18 years was not impossible. What she also understood was that the conclusion Vane's lawyers were drawing from it was not the only conclusion available. The water rights agreement was filed separately from the boundary description. It referenced the watershed position, not the creek centerline. A careful reading of the original filing suggested it had been written that way deliberately, by someone who understood that natural features moved and wanted the rights to rest on something more permanent. She folded her notes and pressed them flat with her palm. In the morning, before the ranch was fully awake, she found Pete at his usual early hour in the doorway of the bunkhouse, drinking coffee and watching the sky go pale. "Do you know if there are any other ranchers downstream who've had water disputes with Vane?" she asked without preamble. Pete turned to look at her. He'd learned in the past 3 weeks that Clara's questions were not conversational. "Harlan Briggs had something," he said. "Maybe 2 years back. His property's south of here, on the lower Callaway. I don't know the details. The whole thing sort of went quiet after a while. And there was a family out near the Dutton Flats area, but they ended up selling. I never knew if the sale was connected." "I need to talk to Harlan Briggs." Pete considered this. "That's a half-day ride." "I know. I'm not asking you to take me. I'm asking whether he's the kind of man who'd be willing to talk." "Harlan talks," Pete said. "Sometimes more than you want him to. Whether he'll talk about this," he shrugged. "I can send a message with the weekly supply rider. Have him meet you in Millhaven, maybe. Neutral ground." "Do that," Clara said. "And don't tell Gus why." Pete looked at her sharply. "Gus is a good man," Clara said. "And I don't think he's working with Vane, but he's also the one who approved the Valley Improvement Partners survey access to the northern pasture without telling Nathaniel, and I'd rather not give information too much room to travel before I understand where it goes." Pete was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not suspicion, more like a recalibration. He'd been around long enough to recognize when someone was thinking several moves ahead of where the conversation appeared to be. "All right," he said. She went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. Nathaniel came down earlier than usual that morning, before the hands came in from their first chores. He sat at the far end of the dining table with his coffee and looked at nothing in particular, and Clara brought out the first of the food and set it on the table without comment. She went back to the kitchen, and then after a moment she came to stand in the doorway. "The water rights filing from your original deed, the one your father's generation established," she said. "Did anyone ever tell you specifically how the language in that agreement was drafted? Whether it was a standard form or whether someone wrote it specially?" Nathaniel looked up from his coffee. He had the slightly distant look of a man who'd slept poorly and was drinking his way back into the present. "I don't know," he said. "I was 19 when the property transferred to me. My father had already been sick for a while. The lawyers in the county seat handled the transfer." "Which firm?" "Kenner and Albright. They're still there, I think. Or they were 2 years ago." Clara filed that. "The agreement has some unusual language," she said. "The way it defines the water right, it's tied to watershed position, not to the creek centerline specifically. That's not typical." Nathaniel's eyes sharpened slightly. "What does that mean for Vane's claim?" "It might mean his claim is weaker than he's presenting it," she said. "But I want to understand why the language was written that way before I say anything stronger than that. Someone wrote it deliberately. I'd like to know who." She turned back toward the kitchen, then stopped. "Did your father have a particular lawyer he trusted? Someone who might have been involved in that original filing beyond the firm?" Nathaniel sat with that for a moment. "There was a man," he said slowly, "Clement Barr. He wasn't a lawyer exactly, some kind of land agent, I think. He helped my father with several transactions over the years. I haven't heard the name in a long time. Is he still alive?" "I genuinely don't know." Clara nodded and went back to the kitchen. She had enough for now to keep moving. The supply rider went out to Harlan Briggs that afternoon with Pete's message, and 3 days later Pete came into the kitchen with the response. Briggs would meet Clara in Millhaven on Thursday at the surveyor's office, which was a detail that told Clara something about Harlan Briggs before she'd met him. A man who suggested meeting at the surveyor's office when discussing a land dispute was a man who thought in terms of documents. She borrowed a horse from the ranch string Thursday morning, not without some negotiation with the hand responsible for the horses, a young man named Cord, who looked at her with the combination of uncertainty and reluctant cooperation she'd come to recognize as the ranch's default posture toward her, and rode the 2 hours to Millhaven with her notes folded inside her coat. Harlan Briggs was already waiting when she arrived, sitting on the bench outside the surveyor's office, with a posture that suggested he'd been waiting long enough to have opinions about it. He was a man in his early 60s with a short gray beard and the blunt, particular way of moving that some men develop when they've spent so many decades outdoors that economy of motion becomes instinct. He shook her hand without comment and looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who'd been told she was a ranch cook and was deciding what to make of that. "Pete Garfield speaks well of you," he said. "Pete speaks carefully of everything," she said. "That's about the best thing anyone can say about a man. That appeared to land correctly. Briggs sat back down on the bench and gestured for her to sit, and for the next hour they talked in the direct, methodical way of two people who both knew what they were there to discuss and didn't see any benefit in arriving at it indirectly. Briggs's situation, 2 years before, had followed a pattern Clara was beginning to recognize. A survey conducted under an unfamiliar company name. A legal letter citing a boundary discrepancy. Pressure to sell or to enter into a partnership arrangement with Vane consolidated that would, in practice, subordinate his water access to Vane's operational needs. Briggs had fought it. He was not a man who sold things he'd built, but the fight had cost him 18 months of legal fees, several broken fences he'd never been able to prove were deliberately damaged, and one winter where his upper pasture access had been disrupted long enough to cost him a significant portion of his herd's condition going into spring. What finally ended it? Clara asked. The claim fell apart when I found the original survey notes from the county archive, Briggs said. The ones filed by the same surveyor Vane's people were trying to contradict. Turns out the man made detailed notations that specifically addressed creek bed migration. He'd anticipated it, noted the watershed position separately from the center line, and recorded his reasoning. Vane's lawyers couldn't argue against the man's own explanation of his own methodology. Clara's hands went still in her lap. What was the surveyor's name? She asked, though she thought she already knew. Price, Briggs said. Aldous Price. County surveyor. Retired now, but apparently meticulous. He's still alive? Was, last I heard. Lives outside Millhaven. His granddaughter runs the dry goods off the North Road. Clara sat very straight for a moment, thinking. Briggs watched her. Blackthorn's original survey was conducted by Price, she said. Briggs looked at her. Then he let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and something grimmer. Of course it was, he said. If he made the same kind of notations, then Vane's tried this scheme before, against a Price-surveyed property, and lost, Briggs said, which means he knows the weakness in his own claim, and he's betting Nathaniel Cross won't find it. Or won't look, Clara said. They sat with that for a moment. The sound of Millhaven's Thursday afternoon traffic moving past them on the road. Wagons, foot traffic, the distant sound of the stock pens 2 streets over. I'll tell you something else, Briggs said, his voice dropping not from caution, but from the weight of what he was about to say. The family out at Dutton Flats that sold, the Enders family, I knew them a little. When they sold fast and they sold quiet, and Mrs. Enders had a look about her at the time that I've thought about since. Not the look of someone who made a decision, the look of someone who had something done to them. Clara looked at him steadily. Do you know where they went? West, I heard. Oregon Territory. Any family left here? Her brother, maybe. Name of Enders, Tom, I think. Works a smaller place up past the Ridgeline Road. Clara rode back to Blackthorn that afternoon with more than she'd left with, which was what she'd hoped for, but also more than she'd expected, which was something else entirely. She spent the ride back organizing what she knew and what she still needed, the horse moving steadily under her and the late afternoon light flat and clear over the grassland. The pattern was visible now. Vane had done this before, at least twice. He'd used a surveying company he controlled to challenge boundaries on Price-surveyed properties. He'd applied legal pressure and physical pressure, the fence damage, the disrupted access, to wear down resistance. Where the target fought back intelligently, as Briggs had, the scheme collapsed. Where the target didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back, as the Enders family apparently hadn't, the scheme succeeded. I was doing it again with Blackthorn, and he was doing it now because Nathaniel Cross was the most valuable target he'd ever attempted, and also, in Vane's assessment, the most vulnerable. A man hollowed out by grief and 5 years of going through motions was, from a predator's perspective, the best possible kind of target. Enough assets to make the prize worth pursuing, not enough present-minded engagement to mount a real defense. What Vane had not accounted for was a cook who read documents. She arrived back at Blackthorn to find a scene she hadn't anticipated. Marcus Vane's carriage was in the yard. She could see it from 50 yards out. A good carriage, well-maintained, the kind of thing that communicated money without being ostentatious about it, which was its own form of ostentation. 2 men she didn't recognize were standing near it, and as she rode in and past them, she caught the particular quality of stillness that men have when they've been told to wait and to watch. She unsaddled the horse herself and put it up, then went to the kitchen through the back entrance. She could hear voices from the main room, low, the kind of modulated conversation that happened when one party was being carefully agreeable and the other hadn't yet decided how to respond. She started the evening meal without hurrying it. The stove needed its hour. The bread was already past the point of salvage for tonight, but there was enough of yesterday's, and she had a pot of beans that had been on low since morning that would be ready by the time the men came in from the fields. She moved through the kitchen's familiar rhythms and let the sounds of the main room tell her what they could. She caught Vane's voice once, clearly, a voice accustomed to rooms, full-bodied and well-projected, the voice of a man who'd learned early that how you filled a space with sound affected how people received what you said. Partnership arrangements don't have to be complicated, Nathaniel. I'm suggesting something that benefits both our operations. She didn't hear Nathaniel's response. The walls absorbed it. An hour later, Gus appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who'd been in the presence of something he didn't enjoy and was glad to be away from it. "Vane still here?" Clara asked. "Just leaving." Gus came in and sat heavily at the work table. He brought contracts. "Did Nathaniel sign anything?" "No, but he didn't throw him out either, which—" Gus rubbed the back of his neck. "Vane's getting more specific. Before it was partnership talk, general stuff. Tonight he had actual documents, specific terms. A valuation of the northern pasture that—" He shook his head. "The valuation was low. Not insultingly low, but low. The kind of number you'd come up with if you already knew you were going to control the water access." "Did you read the documents?" "Enough to know I didn't like them." "What did Nathaniel say about them?" Gus was quiet for a moment. "He said he'd think about it." Clara set down the spoon she was holding. She picked it up again almost immediately because there was no useful response to that sentence that she could make to Gus, and standing with a spoon in her hand gave her something to do while she decided not to make the useless ones. "Where is he now?" she said. "Office." She served the evening meal when the hands came in, put everything on the table, and when the room had settled into the particular noise of men eating and talking after a day's work, she took a plate and carried it up the stairs. She knocked on the office door. "It's Clara. I've got your supper." A pause. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm doing it." He opened the door. The office looked like it had looked the first time she'd been in it, except that now there were documents spread across the desk. Not the original deed papers, which she'd returned to the wooden box, but newer papers. Vane's contracts, she understood. She put the plate on the corner of the desk and looked at them without touching them. The language was deliberate and dense, the kind of drafting that meant 3 different things depending on which paragraph you were looking at. She could see, from where she stood, the valuation figure Gus had mentioned. "Gus is right," she said. "That number is wrong." Nathaniel sat down and looked at the plate, then at the papers, then at her. "Vane's lawyers prepared these," he said. "They have the survey data." "The survey data is from a company Vane owns," Claire said. "His lawyers prepared documents based on a survey conducted by his own operation. That's not evidence. That's a man writing his own homework." Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the flat reserve of the past few weeks, not the distant tolerance. Something more present, more complicated. Like a man who'd been sleeping and was waking up faster than was entirely comfortable. "You went to Millhaven today," he said. "I went to talk to Harlan Briggs." A stillness. "Briggs. What does Harlan Briggs have to do with—" "Vane ran the same scheme against Briggs 2 years ago," Clara said. She sat down across from him without being asked, because this was not a conversation that benefited from one person standing. Same pattern. Valley Improvement Partners Survey, boundary dispute letter, pressure to sell or partner. Briggs fought it and won, because he found Aldous Price's original survey notes in the county archive. Price surveyed your property too. If his notes address watershed position the way they addressed it on Briggs's land, then Vane's claim has the same weakness, Nathaniel said. "And Vane knows it," Clara said, "which means he's betting you won't look." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the contracts on the desk the way you look at something you've been too close to, when distance suddenly shows you its actual shape. "He came in here tonight like he was doing me a favor," he said. His voice was level, but something underneath it had gone tight. "He thinks he is," Clara said. "He thinks he's offering a drowning man a rope. He doesn't know the man isn't drowning." Nathaniel looked at her. "You need to go to the county archive," Clara said, "or send someone. We need Price's original survey notes for the Blackthorn filing, and I need to find out if there's a man named Tom Enders still living up past Ridgeline Road, because his sister sold land to Vane under circumstances that I think look very similar to what's happening here. Who's Tom Enders? The brother of a family Vane got to before Briggs. They sold. I want to know what happened. Nathaniel Cross sat in his office with the contract spread in front of him and looked at his cook with the particular expression of a man who is reassessing several things simultaneously and is not entirely comfortable with what the reassessment is producing. You went to Millhaven today to look into this, he said, without telling me. I didn't want to tell you things that might not be true, Clara said. Now I'm telling you things I'm more certain about. You've been here less than a month. Yes. He was quiet. She waited. Why? He said again. The same question I asked you before. I gave you an honest answer then. Give me one now too. Clara looked at him steadily. Because I watched my father sign papers he didn't understand and lose everything he had, and there was nothing I could do about it because I was too young and didn't know enough, and nobody around him had the sense to look at what was actually in those papers. She paused. I'm not too young now. I know enough. And I'm looking. The room was quiet. Somewhere below, the sound of the hands finishing up for the evening, voices, boots on the wooden floor. Nathaniel reached forward and turned the contracts face down on the desk. What do you need me to do? He said. That was the question she'd been waiting for. Not because she needed permission, but because without him, the question of what could be done had limits she couldn't get past alone. Blackthorn was his property and his name, and no amount of research she could do would mean anything if the man who owned the land wasn't standing behind it. Tomorrow morning, she said, I need you to write a letter to Kenner and Albright, the law firm that handled your father's property transfer. Ask them for the complete file from that transaction, specifically anything relating to the water rights agreement and the original survey commission. Tell them you're reviewing your property documents and need the original file for reference. All right? Don't mention Vane in the letter. Why not? Because lawyers talk, she said, and some of them talk to other lawyers. I don't want Vane to know you're looking at the original filing until we have all of it in front of us. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I also need you to be civil to Marcus Vane for a while longer, Clara said. This was the part she'd been least sure how to present, and she said it without softening it because she thought he deserved a direct approach. Not agreeable, not interested, just civil. Don't sign anything, don't reject anything in a way that forces his hand before we're ready. If he thinks you're still considering his offer, he won't escalate. You're asking me to pretend I'm thinking about selling my land to the man who's trying to steal it. I'm asking you to not tip your hand until your hand is strong enough to tip, Clara said. Something moved across his face. Not offense, she thought, more like a man testing the weight of a thing and finding it heavier than expected, but also more solid than expected. You know what my father used to say? Nathaniel said. I don't. He used to say the most dangerous thing on the frontier wasn't a man with a gun. It was a man who'd figured out the rules and wasn't planning to follow them. He paused. I always thought he was talking about outlaws. Clara gathered herself to go. She had to be up before 5, and it was already past 8, and there was more to do tomorrow than today had contained. He wasn't wrong, she said. He just had the wrong category of person in mind. She picked up the empty plate from the corner of his desk and left him sitting there with the face-down contracts and the remains of an evening he was already seeing differently than the one he'd thought he was having. Downstairs, the kitchen was quiet. She cleaned what needed cleaning and made her notes for tomorrow in the back of the supply ledger, the one where she'd been keeping her real records. Supply requirements on the right-hand pages. Everything else on the left. Names, dates, what she knew and what she didn't. The shape of things as she understood them. She wrote, Price Survey Notes, County Archive, Tom Enders, Ridgeline Road, Clement Bar, Whereabouts Unknown, Kenner and Albright, Original Transfer File. Then below that, because she was honest with herself even when she wasn't sharing everything with other people, Vane will move faster if he senses resistance. Need everything before he does. She closed the ledger and put it back in its place on the shelf, between the flour records and the account of what the smokehouse had produced last month. Anyone looking at it would see a cook's working book. That was exactly what she needed them to see. Outside, the wind had come up from the north, working at the loose board on the barn she'd been meaning to mention to Cord for a week now. She could hear it in the kitchen, even with the door shut. A rhythmic complaint, the sound of something insecure in the face of pressure. She'd get to it. She got to things. But first she needed Aldous Price's survey notes, Tom Enders' account of what had happened to his sister's land, and whatever was sitting in the original file at Kenner and Albright. That might tell her why someone had written a water rights agreement with language careful enough to survive 18 years and one very determined enemy. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went upstairs. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and she intended to be ready for it before it started. The letter to Kenner and Albright went out the next morning, written in Nathaniel's hand on the ranch's formal stationery, plain, specific, exactly what Clara had outlined. She watched him write it at the kitchen table rather than in his office, which she didn't comment on but noticed. Something about the office had become, in the past day, a room associated with Vane's contracts and the particular suffocating pressure of that visit, and Nathaniel had apparently decided, without making a decision about it, that he preferred the kitchen's more straightforward air. He wrote carefully. He had good penmanship, the kind that came from education rather than affectation, and the letter was done in one draft without crossing out, which told her he'd been thinking about the language before he sat down. He folded it and passed it to her, and she read it. "Good," she said, and meant it. He looked slightly surprised, which she understood. He wasn't accustomed to being told he'd done something well because he hadn't been doing things that required assessment. He'd been going through motions that didn't produce results good or bad, just continuous, like a mill wheel turning with nothing to grind. "Add one line," she said. "Ask them specifically about any correspondence with a land agent named Clement Barr in relation to the water rights filing." Barr. You think he's connected to why the language was written that way? I think someone was careful on purpose, and I want to know who taught them to be careful. She handed the letter back. If Barr was involved in the original filing, he may know things the firm's standard file doesn't contain. Nathaniel added the line, refolded the letter, and gave it to Cord to take into Mill Haven with the morning errands. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a moment longer than necessary, which was something he'd been doing lately, staying in the kitchen after business was concluded, in the particular way of someone who found the room easier to be in than the alternatives. Clara didn't chase him out. She needed the work table, but there was room enough, and the presence of another person in the kitchen who wasn't there to demand something was not unpleasant. "You said you'd tell me when you had enough to be more certain about," he said. "I do now, or close to it." She wiped down the work table and set out the things for the midday bread. Vane's pattern is clear. He targets properties that hold strategic water access, uses Valley Improvement Partners to conduct surveys that manufacture boundary disputes, then applies legal and physical pressure until the owner either sells or partners on his terms. He's done it at least twice before your property. Once failed, Briggs, and once succeeded. The one that succeeded, the Enders family, they sold fast and moved west. I want to find Tom Enders before I say anything stronger about what happened to them. You think there was more than legal pressure? Clara was quiet for a moment. The fence damage Briggs described wasn't incidental. Someone organized it, and the Enders family sold quickly, which means the pressure on them was sufficient to override the normal human reluctance to give up something you've built. She paused. I don't know yet. I want to know before I assume. Nathaniel was quiet, turning his coffee cup in his hands. You know what strikes me, he said, not to her exactly, more to the room. I've been sitting in that office for 5 years reading ledgers and letting Gus handle the day-to-day, and in 4 weeks you've put together more of a picture of what's happening on my own land than I had. Clara measured flour without looking up. You were dealing with other things. That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it, she said. Grief takes what it takes. The question isn't how long it lasted. The question is what happens now. He didn't respond to that directly, which was fine. She wasn't asking for a response. She was stating a position. She sent word to Pete that afternoon about Ridgeline Road, and Pete, who had a network of connections across the valley that reflected 19 years of being the kind of man people trusted without thinking about why, came back by evening with the information that Tom Enders did, in fact still work a small cattle operation past the Ridgeline Junction, about 12 miles north of Blackthorn. He was a quiet man, Pete said, kept to himself since his sister's family left. But he was there. She rode out to find him on a Thursday, the same day Cord returned from Mill Haven with the news that Kenner and Albright had received the letter and sent back a brief acknowledgement promising the file within 10 days. 10 days was longer than Clara wanted, but law firms operated on their own calendar, and there was nothing to be done about it except keep moving on the other threads while she waited. Tom Enders was a lean man in his 50s with a face that had been weathered into something almost expressionless. The kind of face that had started out capable of a wide range of things, and had been narrowed down by circumstance to something more defended. I was fixing a section of his fence line when she arrived, and he didn't stop working when she introduced herself, just kept setting the post while she talked, which she recognized as a form of self-protection. Doing something with your hands gave you somewhere to put your eyes. She told him she was from Blackthorn Ranch. She told him Vane had filed a boundary claim against the property. She did not dress it up or approach it from an angle. Tom Enders set his post weight down. "How much do you know?" he said. "Enough to know I don't know enough," she said. "I know your sister sold fast, and I know the timeline matches what Vane did to Harlan Briggs." Briggs fought back. "Yes. He found Price's survey notes." Tom looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, but the particular expression of a man who recognizes that the person in front of him has done actual work before coming to ask questions. "My sister didn't know about the survey notes," he said. "None of us did. And by the time they filed the legal claim, there was other pressure too." He paused, and the pause was the kind that contained more than the words that came before and after it. 3 of their cattle went down in a week. Illness, the county vet said. But the illness came right after Vane's man had been out to look at their upper pasture. Invited, my sister thought, as part of the partnership discussion. She never proved anything. Clara was still. "And then the well on the east section went bad," Tom continued. "Bad water. They had to pull their cattle off that section for 2 months, which put pressure on the west grazing that they couldn't sustain going into winter. Vane's offer came right in the middle of all that. It felt..." He stopped. "It felt like rescue. That's what makes me sick about it. By the time he made the offer, it felt like the only door in the room." "Did you tell anyone? The county sheriff? Anyone?" "We told the sheriff," Tom said flatly. "He listened. He wrote something down. Nothing came of it. Vane gives to the county road fund every year, and everyone in the territory knows it." Clara rode back to Blackthorn with that sitting in her chest. Not despair. She was not built for despair. But the particular heaviness of understanding that the thing you're facing is larger and more deliberate than you'd initially assessed. Vane wasn't just a man using legal tricks. He was a man who used legal tricks as the visible layer of a strategy that included physical sabotage, and he'd been doing it long enough to know how to keep the physical layer below the threshold of proof. She needed the Price survey notes. She needed the Kenner and Albright file. And she needed something else, something she hadn't yet identified, that would be specific enough to Blackthorn's situation to constitute proof rather than pattern. She found it, unexpectedly, in the kitchen garden. She was out there on a Saturday morning, working the garlic bed and pulling the encroaching grass from the perimeter of the second raised bed, when she turned over a section of border stone and found beneath it a flat piece of tin with writing on it. The tin had been there long enough that the edges had oxidized and the top was stained with soil, but the writing, pressed in with something sharp, not written but incised, was still legible. West Fork marker, original line, MC and AP, year 12 of the grant. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. MC Margaret Cross, the initials of Nathaniel's dead wife, AP Aldous Price. Year 12 of the grant would have been approximately 8 years ago, after the property had transferred to Nathaniel, but while Margaret was still alive. She brought the tin inside and cleaned it carefully and set it on the work table and looked at it for a long time before she took it upstairs to Nathaniel. He was in the office. He'd been in the office more than usual this week, which she'd noticed with some concern. Not the old withdrawal, but something more active. The look of a man re-engaging with papers he'd let sit too long and finding the re-engagement uncomfortable. He looked up when she came in, and she put the tin on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. Something passed across his face that had nothing to do with the legal situation. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The garden, under the border stones of the second bed." He picked it up carefully. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "She used to work with Price," he said after a moment. "When he did the supplemental watershed survey, I didn't know about it at the time. I was dealing with something in the southern pasture. She went out with him for 2 days and walked the upper boundary. She said she wanted to understand the property the way the documents understood it." He paused. That was about 8 years ago." A year before she got sick. Clara waited. She never mentioned putting anything in the garden, he said. She may have done it as a private marker, something she could find again. Clara kept her voice even. The notation matches the West Fork boundary of the upper pasture. The section Vane's survey is contesting. If she was present when Price did the supplemental work, she may have had access to his field notes, or her presence may be documented in his records of that survey. Nathaniel looked up from the tin. If Price's supplemental survey 8 years ago revisited the upper boundary, Clara said, and if Margaret was present when he did it, then we have corroborating witnesses and documentation of the boundary position from 2 sources, the original survey and a later supplemental. That's not a discrepancy. That's a consistent record across 2 different time points. The office was very quiet. You need to talk to Price, Nathaniel said. I need you to talk to Price, Clara said. He knew Margaret. He'll talk to you. Nathaniel stood up from the desk. He was not a man who moved quickly. He had the physicality of someone accustomed to deliberate motion. But there was something in the way he stood that was different from the way he'd been standing for the past 5 years. Something more vertical about it. When? He said. Tomorrow, Clara said. He lives outside Millhaven. His granddaughter runs the dry goods on the North Road. We can find his address through her. He nodded. Then he looked down at the tin again, and the expression on his face was not something Clara tried to name or address. She simply left him with it and went back downstairs. Price lived 3 miles outside Millhaven on a small property that had once been a working farm and was now more of a kept garden with a house attached, an old man's project, the kind of ordered, intentional growing that people take up when they're done with the urgency of things and want something that moves at a slower pace. He was 71, white-haired, and completely in possession of himself, which Clara registered with relief. She'd been half afraid of finding a man whose memory had gone soft. His memory had not gone soft. He met them in his front room. Nathaniel had driven himself, something he hadn't done in Clara didn't know how long, and she'd ridden alongside. And when he saw Nathaniel, he shook his hand with both of his and said he was sorry for the loss of Margaret in a way that suggested he'd been meaning to say it for years and was glad for the occasion. Then he sat down and listened to what they needed. He didn't speak for a long moment when they were done. He was the kind of man who processed before responding, which was a quality Clara respected even when it made her impatient. Valley Improvement Partners, he said finally. I know the name. I know the man running it too, though he's been careful to keep his name off the incorporation documents. His name is Fowler. Same Fowler who was doing survey work on your northern pasture. The county records clerk? Clara said. He's not the records clerk, Price said. He's a surveyor who also has a clerk's badge, which he uses to control what gets filed and when in the county archive. He's been in that position for about 4 years. His voice was precise and unhurried. He controlled what got filed when Briggs's challenge came in. And he was in a position to delay or misfile documents if Briggs hadn't pushed hard enough for them. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Price. The supplemental survey I conducted 8 years ago, Price said. I conducted it because Margaret Cross came to me and asked me to. She'd found something in the original survey plat that she thought was incomplete, a notation about the West Fork position that she felt should be formally documented in the county record as a standalone filing, not just as part of the deed attachment. He paused. She was right. I went out with her and we walked the boundary, and I prepared a supplemental survey record that I filed with the county office. Is that filing still there? Clara asked. Price looked at her steadily. That's the question, isn't it? She understood immediately. Fowler. Fowler has been the filing clerk for 4 years. My supplemental survey was filed 6 years before that, which means it should be in the archive. But whether it's findable, whether it appears in the index where anyone searching for Blackthorn's records would find it, he lifted his hand slightly. I filed it. Whether it's been made to disappear within the system is something I can't tell you without going there myself. Can you do that? Clara said. I'm retired, Price said. Not dead. Yes, I can do that. He looked at Nathaniel. Your wife understood that property, Mr. Cross. She understood it better than most owners I've worked with. She was the one who pointed out that the West Fork marker had never been formally recertified after the natural flooding in year 9 of the grant. She was the one who initiated the supplemental. If that record is in the archive where I put it, it establishes the boundary position from 2 independent surveys 6 years apart And no bot surveyor claiming 40 feet of creek drift is going to overcome that. Nathaniel was very still in his chair. She never told me any of this, he said. Not with accusation, with something sadder than that. She may not have wanted to worry you, Price said, or she may have thought it was settled once the supplemental was filed and there was nothing more to think about. He was quiet for a moment. She was a practical woman. She identified a problem and addressed it. She may not have mentioned it because, in her understanding, it was handled. Clara watched Nathaniel absorb that. There was grief in the room, but also something else, a quality of recognition, of a man understanding something about a person he'd loved that he hadn't known while she was alive. She let it be. Some things needed the space to be what they were. On the ride back, Nathaniel didn't speak for the first several miles. The road ran through open country that afternoon, the grassland dry and pale in the late-season light, and Clara rode beside him without filling the silence. She had learned when to fill silence and when not to. She was protecting the ranch, he said finally, before there was anything to protect it from. She saw the weakness, and she fixed it. She did, Clara said. I didn't know she was doing it. You couldn't have. I should have. He stopped himself. That's not a useful sentence, is it? Not particularly, Clara said. What's useful is that she did it, and the record exists, and now we need to find it before Vane moves to the next stage. He nodded slowly, accepting the redirect. 3 days after the visit to Price, Vane's next move arrived, and it was worse than Clara had anticipated. She was in the garden in the early morning when Cord came out of the bunkhouse at a pace that he didn't usually move, and his face had the particular tight look of a young man carrying bad news he didn't know how to give. She stood up and looked at him. What happened? Fences down on the north boundary, he said. Big section. The cattle in the upper pasture went through overnight. We've got maybe 40 head scattered across the contested area and into Vane's adjacent land. Clara felt the cold clarity of something anticipated arriving. How much of the fence? 40, 50 yards, not a break. It was cut. She said nothing. She pulled off her garden gloves and walked back to the kitchen and stood at the work table for a moment. This was the escalation. Cattle on contested land, fence that had been deliberately cut. Vane's lawyers would file immediately. There'd be a claim of property trespass, possibly an emergency motion to establish temporary control of the boundary area, which would give Vane's people legal access to the upper pasture while litigation proceeded. And litigation on a temporary control motion moved faster than litigation on the underlying dispute, which meant the window for establishing Blackthorn's position was narrowing. She went upstairs and knocked on Nathaniel's door. He was already up. He'd heard Cord, or heard something, and he came to the door dressed and alert with the particular alertness of a man whose body still remembered, even after 5 years of grief-induced stillness, that there were mornings that required full presence. She told him what Cord had said. "We need to go up there," he said immediately. "Yes," she said. "But before you do, don't touch the fence posts. Don't let any of the hands touch them. The cuts in the wire are evidence, and I want them seen by someone who can testify to how they were made before anyone starts repairs." Nathaniel looked at her. "Who? Does Millhaven have a county deputy who isn't connected to Vane's road fund contributions?" He thought. "Garrett Hughes. He's a younger man, been deputy about 3 years. I don't know him well, but Pete says he's straight. Send for Hughes before you do anything else with that fence. And I need someone to ride to Price's property today. Not tomorrow, today. To ask him to go to the county archive and confirm whether the supplemental survey is indexed where it should be. I'll send Cord." "Send Pete," she said. Price knows Pete's face from the Briggs situation. He'll take the urgency more seriously coming from someone he recognizes. Nathaniel was already moving, which was something she hadn't seen from him in its full form before. The decisive physical movement of a man who understood a situation and was responding to it rather than tolerating it. He went down the stairs at a speed she had to match, calling for Cord as he went, organizing the morning with the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. The hands responded differently to that voice than they had in the weeks before. She noticed it, the straightening, the quickening, the particular quality of men who have been waiting for someone to be in charge and are relieved when it finally happens. Deputy Hughes arrived by mid-morning and walked the fence line with Nathaniel while Clara stayed at the ranch headquarters and intercepted the second piece of bad news. A rider from Vane's operation, arriving with a formal letter stating that Valley Improvement Partners had identified unauthorized cattle grazing in the contested boundary area and requesting an immediate meeting to discuss resolution. She took the letter from Vane's rider with a perfectly civil expression, thanked him, and told him Mr. Cross would respond by end of week. The rider looked uncertain, having expected either more resistance or more capitulation. End of week is standard response time for formal correspondence, Clara said pleasantly. You're welcome to wait for water and a meal before riding back. He took the water and left without the meal. When Hughes came back to the main house with Nathaniel, he was carrying a small notebook and a piece of the cut wire he'd secured in cloth. Wire cuts are clean, Hughes said. Too clean for normal wear or a break under pressure. Something with a sharp edge, well maintained. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He paused. I can file an incident report. Can't promise you it goes anywhere past that, given who we're talking about, but it establishes a date and a record. File it, Nathaniel said, without looking at Clara, though he was listening for her response. Also, Hughes said, with the careful tone of a man delivering information he's not sure he should have, the company that conducted the original survey challenge, Valley Improvement Partners. There's a complaint in the county record from Harlan Briggs, filed 2 years ago. It was received and logged, and then he stopped. Then, Clara said, then nothing. No follow-up, no response, no notation of review. It's in the file, but it's essentially been sitting there unacknowledged. He looked at Clara with the direct expression of a man making a decision about what to say next. The filing clerk at the county office, Fowler. His signature is on the log entry that received the Briggs complaint. It's also on the log entry for Valley Improvement Partners survey registration. Both. The room was quiet. He logged his own organization's filing, Nathaniel said, and then made sure the complaint against that organization went nowhere, Clara said. Hughes nodded slowly. I can't say that in an official capacity. Not yet. But I'm saying it here so you understand what you're dealing with. After Hughes left, Nathaniel stood in the main room with a quality of stillness that was different from the old stillness. Not the stillness of a man who'd checked out, but the stillness of a man who was very deliberately not acting before he understood the full shape of what he was facing. Fowler controls the archive, he said. And the complaint process, Clara said, which means Vane's scheme has been running with the compliance of the county filing system. That's not just fraud on a property. That's corruption of the county record. That changes the scale of it. It changes who you need to talk to, Clara said. Not just a lawyer in Mill Haven. You need someone at the territorial level, someone outside the county structure. Nathaniel looked at her. I know someone, he said slowly. A man named Aldridge. He's a land commissioner for the territory. We went to school together, briefly, years ago. I haven't spoken to him in a decade. Can you reach him? I can write to him. Then write to him today, Clara said. Not about Vane specifically. Not yet. Ask him about the process for raising concerns about county filing irregularities. Frame it as a general inquiry. You want to understand the mechanism before you make the accusation. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The expression of a man who was both grateful for her precision and slightly unsettled by it. You think like someone who's been in a courtroom, he said. I think like someone who's watched people lose fights they should have won because they moved too fast, she said. A complaint filed before you have all your documentation just gives the other side time to prepare. We wait until we have everything, and then we don't wait at all. Pete returned from Price's property that afternoon with news that was good and bad in almost equal measure. The good. Price had gone to the county archive and confirmed the supplemental survey was filed. The bad. Its index entry had been altered. It was present in the physical file, but the cross-reference linking it to Blackthorn's primary property record had been removed, which meant anyone searching the primary record would not find it. You would only know to look for it if you already knew it existed. Fowler, Clara said. Pete nodded. Price is furious. I haven't seen a man that quiet and that angry at the same time in a long time. Is he willing to provide a formal statement about the supplemental survey and the alteration? He said, and I'm quoting here because he was very specific about the wording, I have been making accurate records for 40 years, and I will not have a bought clerk undo them without consequence. Clara almost smiled. Tell him we'll be in touch within the week, she said, and tell him to make copies of the supplemental survey document while it's still physically accessible. His own copies kept at his property. She was standing at the kitchen window when she said it, looking out at the garden where she'd found the tin. The garlic bed had been properly cleared now, the border stones reset, the bed turned and ready for the next planting when the season allowed. The tin was in the wooden box with Nathaniel's other property documents, which felt like the right place for it. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Nathaniel in the kitchen doorway. He had the letter to Aldridge in his hand, already sealed. "Ryder goes out in an hour," he said. She nodded. He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway in the particular way of someone who has something to say and isn't sure of the best way to say it, which was a posture she wouldn't have associated with him a month ago. "Gus asked me this morning what's been different lately," he said. "He said the men are different. The work is getting done differently. He asked if I'd said something to them." Clara turned back to the window. "I told him I'd been paying more attention," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "That seemed close enough to the truth," he said. Then he went to give the Ryder the letter, and Clara turned back to the window and the garden and the long work of what was still ahead. She had what she needed now. Almost. Price's testimony, the physical survey document, the pattern established across 3 properties, Hughes's incident report on the fence, and the letter going to Aldridge. The Kenner and Albright file was still coming, and Vane was still out there watching the clock on his cattle trespass claim, expecting a man too tired to fight back. What he was going to find when Friday came and Nathaniel responded to his letter was a different kind of man than the one who had let Vane's contract sit face down on his desk. Clara put water on for the afternoon's work and went back to her notes in the supply ledger. Left-hand pages, where the real record lived. She wrote, "All threads moving. Hold until Kenner file arrives." Then Aldridge. Then everything at once. Outside, the wind had shifted. Coming from the south now, warmer, carrying the smell of the lower pasture, grass and cattle and turned earth, the smell of a working ranch. She pressed her hand flat against the page and let that be enough for the moment. The Kenner and Albright file arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after the letter went out, carried by a firm's junior clerk, who made the ride from the county seat apparently under instruction to deliver it personally rather than trust it to the general post. Clara took that as a sign that someone at the firm had opened the file, understood what was in it, and decided the contents warranted more care than usual. She was right. The file was thicker than she'd expected. 3 decades of correspondence, transaction records, and supplemental documents going back to the original grant. All of it organized in the careful way of a firm that understood its records might someday matter in a room with a judge in it. She carried it to the kitchen table and began working through it methodically while the morning bread was in the oven, moving the pages into groups as she read, her notes growing in the margins of the supply ledger's left-hand pages. Nathaniel found her there an hour later and sat across from her without speaking, watching her read. She'd come to understand that this was something he did when he was present in a situation, but not yet needed. He didn't fill space with noise. It was, she thought, probably one of the better qualities he had, and one that grief had accidentally preserved by keeping him so quiet for so long. "There's a letter in here from Clement Barr," she said without looking up. "What does it say?" She read it through twice before answering. "He was a land agent who worked with your father on several transactions over the years. This letter is dated about 2 years before your father transferred the property to you. Barr writes that he's reviewed the water rights agreement and has concerns about its durability." She paused. Specifically, he writes that the county filing system at the time had a pattern of losing or misfiling supplemental property documents, and that any critical rights agreement should be drafted in language that stood independently rather than relying on a cross-reference survey record. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the early morning sounds of the ranch, boots on frozen ground, cattle in the distance, the smithy starting up. "He wrote the language to survive being orphaned from the survey," Nathaniel said. "He anticipated that the cross-reference might fail," Clara said. "Whether he anticipated it failing on purpose or by accident, I can't tell from this letter. But he wrote the agreement to be self-sufficient. The water right is defined by watershed position, not by the survey plat specifically, which means even if the supplemental survey's cross-reference was removed from the index, which it was, the agreement itself still has legal force." She set the letter down and looked at him. "Vane's lawyers know this," she said. "They have to. They're good enough lawyers to have read the agreement the same way I'm reading it. Which means the boundary dispute isn't the real attack. It's a distraction, something to cost you money and time and energy, while the real pressure, the fence cutting, the cattle disruption, whatever else is coming, wears you down to the point where the agreement's legal strength doesn't matter because you can't afford to enforce it. Nathaniel sat with that for a moment. He's not trying to win in court, he said slowly. He's trying to win before court, Clara said. The legal claim is the cover. The actual method is exhaustion. She watched him process that, watched the particular tightening around his jaw that she'd come to recognize as the expression he made when he was angry in a way he was containing rather than releasing. That's what happened to the Enders family, he said. Yes. The legal claim gave it the appearance of a legitimate dispute, but what actually broke them was the cattle, the well, the financial pressure of a bad season layered on top of legal fees. By the time Vane made his offer, they were too worn down to see it clearly. She turned back to the file and pulled out another document, a thin sheet, handwritten, that she'd set aside earlier. There's also this, she said, a personal letter from Barr to your father, attached at the back of the file. It's not part of the formal record. I think the firm included it because someone there read the whole file and understood why it was relevant. She slid it across the table. Nathaniel picked it up and read it. His expression shifted in the way of someone encountering something unexpected. Barr knew Vane's father, he said. Keep reading. He did. When he set the letter down, the expression on his face was something Clara couldn't fully read, complicated in the way that things are complicated when personal history intersects with present conflict in ways that feel inevitable in retrospect. Barr writes that Vane's father ran a similar operation in another territory 20 years ago, Nathaniel said, using survey disputes and legal pressure to consolidate water access. He was eventually investigated by the Territorial Land Commission, but the investigation was closed before it produced anything formal. He paused. Barr writes that he believes the methodology was taught to the son. The son refined it, Clara said, added the county clerk angle, controlling who files what and what gets indexed. The father's scheme failed because the record-keeping was outside his control. The son fixed that. Nathaniel set the letter back on the table carefully. Barr's been dead for what? 15 years? The letter is dated 22 years ago, Clara said. I don't know when he died. He knew, Nathaniel said. He wrote the water agreement to be durable, and he wrote my father a private letter explaining why, and then he died and my father died and the letter sat in a law firm's file for 20 years. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. And now Vane's son is doing exactly what Barr said his father did. And Barr's agreement is still in our way, Clara said. Which is something. It's something, Nathaniel agreed, though his voice had the quality of a man who found the symmetry of it heavy rather than satisfying. She let him have that. Then she gathered the documents back into their file order and closed the folder. I need to send all of this to Aldridge, she said. Everything. The Barr letter, the water agreement, Price's supplemental survey, the incident report from Hughes on the fence, the pattern documentation from the Briggs situation. I want the Territorial Land Commissioner to see the full picture, not just a piece of it. Aldridge wrote back, Nathaniel said. She looked up. Day before yesterday. I was waiting until I had the Kenner file before I told you. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded letter. She read it. Aldridge's letter was cautious in the way that men in official positions are cautious when they're interested but not yet committed. Formal language, careful framing, but with a sentence near the end that was more direct than the rest. If the county filing records have been interfered with in the manner you describe, this falls within the Territorial Commission's oversight authority and warrants formal examination. He asked for documentation. He's willing, Clara said. He's careful, Nathaniel said, which is different. It's enough, she said. Careful men with authority are more useful than willing men without it. She spent the rest of that morning preparing the package for Aldridge. Not just the documents, but a written summary she drafted herself, 3 pages in her clear, unornamental hand that laid out the pattern, the evidence, and the specific nature of Fowler's involvement in the county filing system. She wrote it the way Barr had written his private letter to Nathaniel's father, directly, without hedging what she knew and without claiming more than she could support. She gave it to Nathaniel to review before it went out. He read it at the kitchen table slowly. When he was done, he looked up at her. This is going to end Fowler's position, he said. If Aldridge acts on this, Fowler is finished. Yes. And it's going to start a formal investigation into Vane. That's the intent. He looked at the pages in his hand. You understand that once this goes to Aldridge, we can't take it back. Whatever comes after that is out of our hands. It's been out of our hands since Vane dropped those contracts in your yard, Clara said. This is just us acknowledging it. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he set the pages down, picked up a pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the cover letter she'd prepared. It was the first time she'd seen him sign something in weeks, and the difference between this signature and the posture of the man who'd almost signed Vane's contracts was the difference between a man who knew what he was doing and a man who'd been made to feel he had no choice. The package went out with the afternoon rider. 3 days passed in a particular quality of suspended quiet. The cattle had been brought back from the upper pasture and the fence repaired under Hughes's documentation, and Vane's formal letter about the trespass had received Nathaniel's response, brief, civil, acknowledging the fence incident and informing Vane that the matter was under review by the appropriate county authority. The language was Nathaniel's, but the construction was Clara's, designed to signal engagement without concession and to formally put on record that Blackthorn was responding through proper channels. Vane had not responded to that letter yet, which told Clara he was recalculating. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for him to finish recalculating. On the second of the 3 quiet days, Harlan Briggs rode in unannounced in the early afternoon. He came to the kitchen door, which Clara had come to understand was where people arrived when they wanted to talk rather than to make a formal call. Pete let him in and Clara set coffee in front of him, and he sat at the work table with the posture of a man carrying something he wasn't sure how to put down. Vane's been talking to people, he said, to the ranchers downstream, telling them that Blackthorn is threatening to restrict water access, that Cross is planning to renegotiate all the watershed agreements and charge for usage that's been free since the original grant. Clara set down her cup. That's false, she said. I know it's false. But 3 of the downstream operators came to me this week asking if I'd heard anything, because Vane's version of it sounds just plausible enough that it scared them. Briggs wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He's trying to turn the downstream ranchers against Blackthorn. If they believe Cross is planning to restrict their water, they'll either side with Vane or stay neutral, which amounts to the same thing. What did you tell them? Clara asked. I told them what I knew, which is that Cross hasn't said a word to anyone about water renegotiation, and that this sounds like Vane spreading fear to isolate the biggest obstacle to his plans. He paused. But me telling them isn't enough. They need to hear it from Cross directly. Clara looked at Nathaniel, who had come in from the yard midway through Briggs's account, and was standing near the door with the particular attention of a man absorbing information that required a response he hadn't yet formulated. A meeting, Nathaniel said. All the downstream operators. Here, Clara said. At Blackthorn. Show them the property, show them the records, let them ask their questions directly. Briggs looked between them. That's a significant thing to organize in a short time. How short? Nathaniel asked. Vane's deposition about the trespass claim is filed for 2 weeks from Friday. If he gets the downstream operators to file supporting statements about water concerns before that, it complicates your position significantly. You'd want the meeting before then. Briggs did the arithmetic. 10 days. Send riders tomorrow morning, Clara said to Nathaniel. Every downstream operator. Invite them here for a week from Saturday. Supper, tours of the upper watershed, and whatever documentation they want to see. Nathaniel looked at her. Supper for how many? Tell me the number and I'll manage the supper, she said. That's the easy part. Briggs almost smiled at that. The next day, riders went out to 7 properties along the Callaway watershed, carrying handwritten invitations that Nathaniel had composed at the kitchen table the previous evening. The composition had taken him longer than Clara expected. Not the words themselves, but the particular act of reaching out to people he'd been largely absent from for 5 years. People who'd watched Blackthorn drift under his inattention and had drawn their own conclusions about his capacity to manage what he owned. She found him staring at the half-written third letter with an expression that had nothing to do with legal strategy. They're going to come because they're worried about their water, she said, not because they've already decided anything about you. Let them come and make the decision after they've seen what they need to see. Some of them I haven't spoken to in 2 years, he said. Then you're overdue, she said, and put a fresh piece of paper in front of him and waited until he picked up the pen. 5 of the 7 properties sent back word that they'd come. A sixth, a man named Castile, who ran a sheep operation at the southern end of the watershed, sent a shorter message saying he'd already heard Vane's version of events and was satisfied with it. The 7th didn't respond, which could mean anything. Clara noted Castile and the non-respondent and set them aside. 5 was enough, and Briggs would be there, and Pete had mentioned that 2 of the downstream operators were men whose opinions tended to carry weight with the others. If those 2 left the meeting with the right understanding, the others would follow. The preparation for the meeting was the most complex thing Clara had managed at Blackthorn since her arrival, and she managed it the way she managed everything, by breaking it into its component parts and addressing each one in the order it needed addressing, without making the whole of it larger in her mind than it actually was. She organized the kitchen for a supper of 8, which she could do in her sleep. She prepared the property document package with Nathaniel's help. Copies of the key records, the bar letter, the water rights agreement, Price's written account of the supplemental survey, and what had been done to its index entry. She prepared a brief written summary of the vein pattern across all 3 properties, factual and specific, 2 pages that a person could read in 5 minutes and understand clearly. She asked Nathaniel to walk her through the upper watershed 2 days before the meeting, not because she needed to understand it for the documents, but because she wanted to understand it for herself. They walked the boundary line in the early morning, before the work of the day made it impractical. The upper pasture was open country, the Callaway Creek visible in the distance, the West Fork Junction identifiable once you knew what you were looking at. Nathaniel walked it with the ease of a man who knew every foot of his own land, even after years of minimal engagement with it, the way people know the rooms of a house they grew up in even when they've been away. Margaret walked this with Price, he said at one point. They were standing near the West Fork, where the creek divided and the boundary marker had been recorded in the supplemental survey. I know, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. I keep finding pieces of her in this, he said. In the documents, in what Price said. She was doing things I didn't know about, watching over things I wasn't watching. Clara looked at the creek and the dry grass around it and the pale sky. She loved this place, she said. She did. Then she'd be satisfied with what you're doing now. Clara turned to walk back toward the ranch buildings. That's what matters. He followed her, and they went back down together without speaking much, which was its own kind of communication. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon as planned. The 5 downstream operators arrived across a window of about 2 hours, some together, some separately, all of them with the slightly cautious manner of men who've been told something unsettling and are trying to get at the truth of it without committing to a position before they have enough information. Briggs arrived first and helped Clara and Pete organize the sitting room, which hadn't been used for a gathering of this size in years. The furniture rearranged to accommodate 8 around the main table. Clara cooked what she cooked for that kind of occasion. Substantial food that didn't require attention, things that could sit and be served without drama, that gave people something to do with their hands while they talked. She stayed in the kitchen through most of the formal discussion, which was where she intended to be. But she could hear it. Nathaniel opened with the water rights question directly, which was what she'd suggested. Don't let them raise it as a concern. Raise it yourself, plainly, and answer it plainly. He told them he had no intention of renegotiating water access agreements. He told them he'd heard what Vane was saying, and it was false. He told them he was saying this clearly because the downstream ranchers were part of the valley's working community, and they deserved to hear his actual position rather than someone else's version of it. The room was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then one of the men, she'd learn later it was Reston, who ran the largest downstream operation, said, "Then what is Vane's interest in your boundary dispute, if it's not about the water?" And Nathaniel said, "That's exactly the right question," and opened the document package. The next hour was the kind of hour that determined things. She could hear the quality of it changing as it went. Not smoothly, not without objection and question, and the occasional blunt pushback of men who were not inclined to accept a narrative that complicated their existing understanding, but with the particular weight of evidence accumulating in a room where people were willing to look at it. Briggs spoke. Price had sent a written statement, read aloud. The bar letter was passed around. The incident report from Hughes on the fence was placed on the table. Clara brought out the food at the right moment. The moment when the energy in the room needed something to shift around, when the men needed to move from absorbed attention to the more relaxed posture of people who have received significant information and need time to sit with it before they respond. She'd learned that timing this correctly was one of the most useful things a cook could do in a room full of people talking through something difficult. She set the food down, made no comment, and went back to the kitchen. Reston came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later. I was a large, deliberate man, not unlike Nathaniel in his physical quality, the size of someone who'd worked outdoors for decades, though older, closer to Price's age. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Clara with the frank assessment she was getting used to receiving. "You put this together," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Cross organized the meeting," she said. "Cross organized it because someone organized him," Reston said. "I've known Nathaniel Cross for 15 years. What I saw in that room tonight is not a man who put this together alone." He paused. "I'm not saying that as criticism." Clara looked at him. "What are you saying it as?" "Acknowledgement," he said. He leaned one hand against the doorframe. "Vane's going to know this meeting happened. He's going to know what was shared, and he's going to respond. You should expect that the response will be faster than anything he's done so far, because he'll understand that the downstream community has seen the documentation and isn't going to file supporting statements for his trespass claim." "I know," she said. "What's your next move?" Clara turned back to the stove. "Aldridge," she said, "the Territorial Land Commission. We've already sent documentation. Now we wait for him to act on it." Reston was quiet for a moment. "Aldridge is a careful man. Everyone keeps telling me that." "It means he won't move until he has enough to move decisively," Reston said, "which is not a criticism of him. It means what you've sent him needs to be airtight." "It is," Clara said. Another pause. "There's a notary in the county seat who's independent of the county filing system," Reston said. "Whatever documents you're relying on, have them formally attested by someone outside Fowler's reach. Aldridge's commission will want notarized copies." Clara looked at him. "I've had occasion to think about county filing reliability before," he said, by way of explanation. "I'll do that," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went back to the sitting room. The men began leaving around 8 in the evening, most of them in better shape than they'd arrived. Not convinced of everything, not ready to commit to anything specific, but with the particular settled quality of people who've been given accurate information and know what to do with it. 3 of them shook Nathaniel's hand at the door with a directness that the handshakes of men arriving hadn't had. Briggs was last to leave. He found Clara cleaning the kitchen, Nathaniel sitting at the kitchen table with the documents stacked in front of him. "Castile's going to be a problem," Briggs said without preamble. "He's too connected to Vane's southern operations. He won't come in against him." "I know," Nathaniel said. "The non-respondent, Whitfield, he'll follow Reston. They've been neighborly for 20 years. If Reston decides Blackthorn is in the right, Whitfield will land the same way." Briggs picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Reston's going to make some inquiries of his own before he commits to anything formal. Give him 3 days." "What happens after 3 days?" Clara asked. "If I know Reston, he's going to write to Aldridge himself," Briggs said. "Independently. Reston's been suspicious of Vane for 2 years, but never had enough to warrant a formal position. What he saw tonight may have been enough." He left, and the kitchen settled into the quiet of a room that had been useful for a significant thing and was now resting. Nathaniel sat with the documents for a while. Clara finished the cleaning and started on the next morning's prep, the rhythmic, necessary work of keeping a place fed, which did not stop because other things were happening. "We should hear from Aldridge within a week," Nathaniel said. "Or sooner," Clara said, "if Reston writes to him." "Do you trust Reston?" She thought about it carefully. "I trust that he understood what he saw tonight. Whether he acts on it the way we need him to..." She paused. "I think he will. He's not a man who absorbs information and does nothing with it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "My father used to bring ranchers together like that," he said, "before I took over. He'd have people to the ranch for supper, and whatever needed to be discussed would get discussed in a room where everyone was present and fed and felt like they were being treated as someone whose opinion mattered." "It works," Clara said. He knew it worked. He looked at his hands on the table. "I let that stop." Clara put the last of the dishes away and dried her hands and stood at the work table. "A lot stopped," she said. "It's starting again." She didn't make it more than that because she didn't need to. He knew what had stopped and what was starting, and he didn't need her to itemize it. She respected him enough to say it once and move on. The next morning brought Cord at a run to the kitchen door before she'd had the stove properly going, and she knew before he said anything that whatever it was would not be the news she'd been hoping for. "Ryder from town came in about an hour ago," Cord said, breathing hard not from the run but from something else, the particular breathlessness of someone carrying news they're not sure how to give. "There's a legal notice filed at the county courthouse. Vane's lawyers filed last night. Emergency motion for temporary access authority over the north boundary area pending resolution of the water rights dispute." Clara was still. "If the motion is granted," Cord continued, "Vane's surveyors can operate on the north boundary without authorization from Mr. Cross. Effectively, they can establish a physical presence on the contested land before the underlying case is resolved," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to the stove and fed the fire in the firebox with the precise, controlled movement of someone managing a strong reaction. An emergency motion. Faster than she'd expected, which meant Reston had been right. Vane knew about the meeting and had responded overnight. He wasn't recalculating anymore. He was accelerating. "Where's Nathaniel?" she said. "He was in the barn when the rider came in." She was already untying her apron. She found Nathaniel in the barn with Pete, and she could see from his face that he'd heard, and from Pete's face that Pete had heard, and from the quality of the air between them that neither had arrived at what came next. "He filed an emergency motion," Nathaniel said. "I know." She had her notes in her apron pocket, the folded pages from the supply ledger, and she pulled them out and looked at them briefly before she spoke. "We need to get everything to Aldridge today, not within the week, today. And we need a lawyer in the county seat, not Kenner and Albright, someone independent, who can respond to the emergency motion before the court acts on it." "Emergency motions can be granted within 48 hours, Pete said, "which means we have until Thursday morning if the filing was yesterday evening," Clara said. 48 hours from the filing, not from now." She looked at Nathaniel. "Do you know anyone at the county courthouse who isn't in Vane's pocket?" Nathaniel thought for a moment, in the fast, deliberate way of a man thinking with urgency rather than around it. "There's a clerk there, woman named Durant. She processed my father's last property tax filing, and she sent a correction to a billing error that benefited us. She didn't have to do that." "That's not nothing," Clara said. "I need to know whether the emergency motion has been assigned to the judge who handles Vane's usual filings." Pete looked at Nathaniel. "Hargreave," he said. "Vane's motions always go to Hargreave." "I need to know if this one did too," Clara said, "and if there's any basis to request reassignment." She looked at both of them. "I'm going to write the Aldridge package now. Everything, notarized copies as Reston suggested. I need someone to go into Millhaven immediately to find a notary and come back in time for the package to go out this afternoon. And I need Nathaniel to send a message to Reston telling him what happened last night and asking if he's willing to write to Aldridge today rather than in 3 days." The barn was quiet for a moment. Then Pete said, "I'll go to Millhaven," and he was already moving toward his horse before the sentence was finished. Nathaniel watched him go. "Vane's scared," he said quietly. "He's not scared," Clara said. "He's decisive. There's a difference. Scared men make mistakes. Decisive men move fast and make you respond on their timetable rather than yours." She folded her notes back into her pocket. "We need to stop responding and start forcing him to respond to us." "How?" "Get everything to Aldridge today, get a lawyer on the emergency motion by tomorrow morning, and let Reston do what Reston is going to do." She paused. "And there's one more thing." "What?" She looked at him steadily. "Go talk to Tom Enders," she said. "Today, this afternoon. Drive out to Ridgeline Road yourself and talk to him. What happened to his sister's land is part of the pattern we're presenting to Aldridge, but right now it's secondhand. I spoke to him, then reported to you. If you go yourself, you make it a direct account. And you make clear to Tom Enders that you know what happened to his family and that you're not going to let it be buried." Nathaniel looked at her. "He lost his sister's land to the same man who's coming after yours," Clara said. "He deserves to know someone in this valley is fighting back. And you need to be the one who tells him, because you're the one with enough standing to make it matter." He held her gaze for a moment with the particular directness of a man who has accepted that someone else can see the shape of a situation more clearly than he can and is no longer uncomfortable with that fact. "I'll leave within the hour," he said. She went back to the kitchen. She had 2 hours before Pete would return from Millhaven with a notary. She used them to write the most important document she'd written since sitting down with the kitchen's original supply ledger 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. The full account for Aldridge, complete, specific, and signed in her own name as well as Nathaniel's, because she'd decided during the walk to the barn that there was no longer any advantage in being invisible and considerable advantage in being on record. She wrote without hesitation. The light through the kitchen window was flat and gray, a November sky that offered no particular encouragement, and she wrote by it the way she'd done everything since arriving at Blackthorn Valley Ranch, without waiting for better conditions, without expecting the work to be comfortable, with the steady attention of someone who knew that what she was doing was the right thing, and that the right thing and the easy thing had never, in her experience, been the same. Pete returned from Millhaven with the notary at 2:30. A small, precise woman named Mrs. Calloway, who carried her seal in a leather case and asked no questions beyond what was necessary to do her work correctly, which Clara appreciated more than she could have said. They went through the document package at the kitchen table in systematic order, each page attested and sealed with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that the value of what she was doing lay in its exactness. When it was done, Clara wrapped the package in oilcloth against the weather and addressed it to Aldridge at the Territorial Commission office in the capital. The afternoon rider had already left, which meant it would go out first thing the following morning, which meant it would arrive in the capital by Friday at the latest. Friday was the day after the emergency motion's 48-hour window closed. She stood in the kitchen with the wrapped package in her hands and did the arithmetic again, the way she'd been doing it all afternoon, and arrived at the same answer she kept arriving at. It was close. Not impossible. Close. Nathaniel came back from Ridgeline Road as the light was failing, and she could tell before he dismounted that the conversation with Tom Enders had been significant. There was a particular quality to the way he moved when he'd been affected by something. Not slower exactly, but more deliberate. The way people move when they're carrying something internal that needs careful handling. He came into the kitchen and sat at the work table, and Clara put coffee in front of him and waited. He cried, Nathaniel said. Not with embarrassment, not with discomfort, just stating it. Not at first. We talked for an hour. I told him everything we had, the full pattern, what we'd sent to Aldridge. And at the end of it, he said his sister had loved that land more than anything she'd ever owned, and she went west feeling like she'd failed her family, and that feeling killed something in her. He stopped. Tom Enders is a quiet man, but he's not a broken one. He said if there's anything he can do, he'll do it. He'll write to Aldridge himself. He'll come to the county seat if someone asks him to stand up and tell what happened. Clara was quiet for a moment. I told him we'd ask, Nathaniel said. Good, she said. That's exactly right. She wrote to Aldridge a second time that evening. A brief addendum, noting that Tom Enders was prepared to provide a first-person account of the events surrounding his sister's land sale and was available if the commission wished to take a formal statement. She addressed it separately from the main package and gave it to Cord to take into Millhaven first thing in the morning alongside the larger document. Then she banked the kitchen fire and went to bed and lay in the dark for a while listening to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds, which she knew by now the way you know the sounds of a place that has become, without you quite deciding it would, something like home. She thought about Clement Barr, dead for 15 years, who had written a water agreement careful enough to survive the scheme of a man he'd never met, the son of a man he'd known and warned against. She thought about Margaret Cross, who had walked a boundary line with an old surveyor and pressed a tin marker into the earth beneath a garden stone for reasons she'd never explained to anyone. She thought about the way people leave things behind them, sometimes deliberately and sometimes just by living fully in the places they inhabit, and how those things persist even when the people are gone. She thought that there was something worth saying about that, about the way the careful work of people who came before you can shelter you from things they never anticipated, if you know to look for it. Then she went to sleep because she needed to be up before 5, and the day coming had no room in it for a cook who hadn't slept. The emergency motion hearing was set for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the county courthouse, and they drove into Millhaven in Nathaniel's good wagon, Nathaniel and Clara and Pete, with Briggs meeting them at the courthouse steps, and Reston arriving separately, having sent his own letter to Aldridge 2 days prior as Briggs had predicted. The lawyer Nathaniel had engaged, a man named Sewell, who operated out of the county seat and whose reputation for county courthouse work Pete had confirmed through his network of contacts, was already inside when they arrived. Sewell was a thin man with an unhurried manner that Clara suspected was deliberate. The manner of someone who had learned that appearing calm was half the work of a courtroom. He'd reviewed the notarized document package overnight and had filed a formal response to Vane's emergency motion that morning, challenging its factual basis and attaching the price statement and the bar letter as evidentiary exhibits. "The motion is weak," Sewell told them quietly in the corridor outside the courtroom. Emergency access motions require a demonstrated immediate harm. Vane's filing claims the cattle trespass represents ongoing harm to his boundary rights, but the cattle have been returned and the fence repaired, so the immediate harm has been resolved. The motion should fail on that basis alone. "Will it?" Clara asked. Sewell looked at her with the measured expression of a man who'd been in enough courtrooms to be careful about certainty. "It should. Whether it does depends on how Hargreave reads the filed response." She'd been told about Hargreave. She had her own read of what that meant, and she kept it to herself. Marcus Vane was already in the courtroom when they entered, seated at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers she hadn't seen before, not the men who'd carried the leather satchels into Blackthorn's yard on that first day, but more senior figures, polished in the way of men brought in when the situation had escalated beyond routine. Vane looked up when the Blackthorn party came in, and his eyes moved across the group. Nathaniel, Pete, Briggs, Reston, and then landed on Clara with the particular stillness of a man encountering something he hadn't prepared for. She met his eyes without looking away, which was not a challenge and was not a performance. It was simply accurate. She had nothing to hide from his assessment, and no interest in pretending otherwise. Vane's lead lawyer was on his feet before the judge had fully settled, moving immediately to the argument that the emergency motion was necessary to protect his client's property interests against ongoing boundary violations. He was smooth, well-practiced, and Clara could see from the way Hargreave listened that he was listening in the particular way of someone who'd heard this lawyer before and found him credible. Then Sewell stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not use more words than the argument required. He laid out the evidentiary exhibits in order: the original water rights agreement and its watershed position language, the price supplemental survey and its indexed alteration, Deputy Hughes's incident report on the fence, and the bar letter with its documentation of the same methodology used by Vane's father in another territory 20 years prior. The courtroom's quality of attention changed when the bar letter was read into the record. Hargreave's face did not change, but something in his posture did. A slight stiffening, the posture of a man absorbing information that he had not anticipated and was not certain how to receive in the current context. Vane's lead lawyer objected to the bar letter's relevance. Sewell's response was brief and precise. The letter documented a pattern of conduct materially identical to the current scheme, establishing that the methodology was not incidental but deliberate and practiced, and that its originator had been aware of its legal vulnerabilities and had instructed others to construct agreements robust enough to survive it. The letter was directly relevant to the question of whether the emergency motion rested on a legitimate boundary dispute or on a manufactured one. Hargreave allowed the exhibit. The hearing lasted 2 hours. When Hargreave recessed to consider the motion, Clara sat in the corridor on a wooden bench with Pete beside her, and Nathaniel standing at the window looking out at the courthouse square. And the waiting had the quality that waiting always has when the outcome of something you've worked toward is in another person's hands, and there is nothing left to do but hold still. Pete offered her coffee from the tin he'd brought. She took it. "You all right?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, which made him smile briefly. Hargreave returned in 40 minutes. He denied the emergency motion. His stated reason was narrow. The immediate harm criterion had not been met, as the cattle had been returned and the fence restored, and he made no comment on the evidentiary exhibits beyond acknowledging their entry into the record. He set a date for the underlying boundary dispute hearing 6 weeks out and adjourned. It was not a victory. It was a stay. Clara understood the difference clearly, and she kept that understanding to herself as they came back out onto the courthouse steps into the pale November light, because the men around her needed a moment of something that felt like forward motion, and she wasn't going to complicate it unnecessarily. Briggs shook Nathaniel's hand. Reston nodded to both of them with the measured approval of a man who gave approval rarely and meant it when he did. Sewell said he'd be in touch about the 6-week hearing and went back inside with the particular efficiency of a man who had other cases and a limited amount of time. Vane came out of the courthouse a few minutes after them, his lawyers beside him. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked at Nathaniel across the space between them, and it was the look of a man recalculating, not retreating, not defeated, but understanding that the target had changed shape from what he'd initially assessed. Nathaniel looked back at him steadily. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. After a moment, Vane went down the steps to his carriage and drove away. The letter from Aldridge arrived on a Monday, 11 days after the package had gone out. It arrived not by regular mail, but by commission courier, a young man in official dress who asked for Nathaniel Cross by name and handed the letter directly to him, which told Clara what it contained before Nathaniel had broken the seal. She was right. Aldridge had opened a formal investigation into county filing irregularities in Millhaven's Land Records Office, citing the documented evidence of index alteration in the Blackthorn Supplemental Survey record and the documented pattern of Valley Improvement Partners' involvement in boundary disputes across multiple properties. Fowler had been suspended from his clerk position pending the investigation. A commission examiner would arrive in Millhaven within 2 weeks to conduct a review of the county archive, and at the bottom of the letter, a handwritten postscript in Aldridge's own hand. Tom Ender's account was the clearest account I've received of this methodology in practice. Please extend my acknowledgement to him. Nathaniel read the letter twice, standing in the kitchen doorway. Then he handed it to Clara. She read it and handed it back. It's not over, she said, because it wasn't, and he needed to know she knew that. The 6-week hearing is still ahead. Vane's lawyers will adjust their approach, and the investigation takes time. I know, he said. But the mechanism that made it work, Fowler controlling the archive, the indexed cross-reference being removable, that's gone. He can't run the same scheme the same way. Nathaniel folded the letter and held it in his hand for a moment. I want to send word to Tom Enders today, he said. I was going to suggest the same thing, she said. She wrote the note to Tom Enders herself, because Nathaniel asked her to, and because she had things she wanted to say to him that came more easily in her hand than she could have dictated. She told him about the investigation, about Aldridge's acknowledgement, about the fact that his account of his sister's experience had been part of what moved the Territorial Commission from consideration to action. She told him that what happened to his family was not going to remain buried. She didn't promise him the land back because she couldn't promise him that, and she'd learned early enough in life that promises attached to things outside your control were not kindness, but the appearance of kindness, and the difference mattered. She sealed the note and gave it to Cord without ceremony. The 6 weeks before the boundary hearing were the most ordinary weeks Clara had spent at Blackthorn since her arrival, which was its own kind of relief. The work of the ranch went on: cattle, fencing, the late-season field prep, the daily feeding of 11 men who ate differently now than they had when she'd arrived, with the particular appetite of people who believed the place they were working was worth working. The kitchen garden had been properly turned over, and she'd planted the garlic in the repaired beds, a task that could wait months to show results, which suited her. Price came to the ranch twice during those 6 weeks, once to meet with Sewell about his formal testimony for the hearing, and once just to walk the upper watershed with Nathaniel at Nathaniel's invitation. She saw them come back from that walk in the late afternoon, 2 men at very different points in their lives, moving at the same unhurried pace, talking about something she couldn't hear from the kitchen window. Whatever it was, Nathaniel came in afterward with the slightly quieted look of someone who'd been told something that confirmed a thing he'd hoped was true. She didn't ask him what it was. Gus Tremaine came to her one evening in the week before the hearing, standing in the kitchen doorway, with the uncomfortable posture of a man about to say something he'd been working up to for a while. I want you to know, he said, that I didn't know what Fowler was. When I approved the Valley Improvement Partners survey access, I thought it was a routine county survey. I didn't know the company was Vane's. Clara turned from the stove and looked at him. I know that, she said. You weren't sure of it when this started, he said. I noticed you were careful about what you told me. I was careful about what I told everyone, she said. That's not a judgment about you specifically. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see that this was a man who took his responsibilities seriously enough that the idea of having unwittingly contributed to the scheme had been sitting on him since he'd understood the full picture. You did nothing wrong, she said. Vane's scheme worked by looking legitimate from the outside. That's the point of it. The only failure would have been not looking more carefully once the legal letter arrived, and by then you were already being careful. She paused. You approved the supply order I brought you in my first week without changing a single item. I noticed that. He looked slightly surprised. A man who respects a reasoned argument is not a man who makes careless decisions, she said. Stop carrying this. He left, and she went back to her work, and she thought about the way guilt works in good people, how it attaches to things they couldn't have controlled and hangs there longer than it should, taking up space that more useful things need. She'd seen it in Nathaniel, too, in the weeks since the hearing, the way he'd started revisiting his 5 years of inattention with an accounting eye that was harsher than the evidence warranted. She'd told him once, directly, that self-accounting was only useful if it produced a different future rather than a better documented regret. He'd looked at her with the particular expression he made when she said something that landed squarely in the middle of a thing he'd been circling. The boundary hearing was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in stories people tell afterward. It was 4 hours of legal argument in a room that smelled of old paper and wood polish, with Sewell presenting the case with the same unhurried precision he'd demonstrated at the emergency motion hearing, and Vane's lawyers working with the reduced resources of people whose central mechanism had been dismantled. Without Fowler's cooperation, the survey challenge rested on Valley Improvement Partners' data alone, and Valley Improvement Partners' credibility had been materially damaged by the commission investigation. The survey methodology had been called into question in the formal record. The judge, a different judge, this time because Hargreave had recused himself without public explanation, which was itself a form of statement, reviewed the documentary evidence with the deliberate attention of someone doing it properly. Price testified. He was old and white-haired and completely authoritative about the work he'd spent his life doing, and he described the supplemental survey and its indexed alteration in language so clear and specific that even the counter-argument from Vane's best lawyer sounded like it was working against the grain of the obvious. Tom Enders submitted a written statement, which Sewell read into the record. When it was over, the judge ruled in Blackthorn's favor on the boundary question. The original survey boundary confirmed by the supplemental survey stood. The water rights agreement was valid and enforceable. Valley Improvement Partners' survey did not constitute sufficient evidence to override an established record supported by 2 independent surveys and a signed attestation from the original surveyor. Outside the courthouse, in the cold of a December afternoon, Nathaniel shook Sewell's hand, shook Briggs's hand, shook Reston's hand. He was not effusive about it. He was not, Clara had come to understand, a man who expressed relief loudly. He expressed it in the way he held himself, in the quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of the past 5 years, lighter in a way that was hard to name but visible once you'd seen the other kind. He turned to Clara last. She was standing slightly back from the group, her coat pulled close against the cold, watching the courthouse square with the expression she wore when she was putting things in order in her mind. He didn't say thank you. She'd told him once, in passing, that thank you was a small container for large things, and she'd rather he didn't try to put this in it. He'd remembered. Instead, he said, "There's a commission examiner in the county archive right now going through everything Fowler touched. Aldridge wrote that the investigation is going to take at least 6 months." "I know," she said. "Vane's other properties, the ones he built with the same methodology, they're all under review now, not just here, the territory." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "It's not what you came here to do." "No," she said. "I came here to cook." Something almost like humor crossed his face, which had been happening more often, the gradual reappearance of an expression she suspected had been present in him before everything went quiet. "The garden's going to need proper planning come spring," he said, "if you're still here." It was the closest he'd come, in 2 months, to asking directly whether she intended to stay. Clara had thought about it. She'd thought about it in the way she thought about most things, systematically, without the kind of romanticism that makes decisions feel larger or more inevitable than they are. She'd come to Blackthorn Valley Ranch with a travel bag and a kitchen knife and a reputation for surviving hard situations. She'd found a kitchen that needed rebuilding, a man who had stopped fighting for what he had, and a scheme that had been designed by someone patient and intelligent and without scruple to take all of it away. She'd done what she could do, which was look clearly at what was in front of her and work steadily against it. The ranch was still standing, The water rights were confirmed. The mechanism of the scheme was broken, and the garden had garlic in it that wouldn't come up until spring. "I'll be here," she said. They drove back to Blackthorn in the late afternoon, the road running through open country under a sky that had gone pale gold at the edges, the way winter skies do in the hour before dark, and the ranch came into view at the end of the long straight road, the way it had come into view on the October morning she'd arrived. Same fences, same buildings, same long approach. But it looked different than it had that morning, and she knew the difference was not in the place but in what she now understood about it. A place was not a collection of buildings and acreage and legal documents, though it was those things too. It was the accumulated effort of everyone who had worked it and worried over it and tried to protect it. Nathaniel's father, who had chosen his land agent carefully. Clement Barr, who had written a water agreement to survive his own obsolescence. Margaret Cross, who had walked a boundary line and pressed a tin marker into garden soil. Aldous Price, who had spent 40 years making accurate records because accuracy was worth something even when no one was watching. Tom Ender's sister, who had loved land she'd lost and carried that loss west with her. All of it had held. Not easily and not without cost, but it had held. Pete was waiting at the gate when they came in, which was not unusual, but beside him was Cord and two of the other hands, which was less usual. They'd heard the hearing's outcome through whatever network of information spread across a working ranch, faster than any formal announcement, and they were there in the way that people are there when something matters to them, and they want to be present at its return. Nathaniel stopped the wagon and looked at them for a moment. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. "Well," Pete agreed, and that was enough. The hands moved back to their evening work, and Nathaniel drove the wagon to the barn, and Clara went to the kitchen to start what needed starting, because it was nearly 5 o'clock and 11 men needed to be fed. She had the stove going and the first of the evening's work underway when Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He did that, still. Arrived in the kitchen in the particular way of someone who was not sure he was needed but was there anyway. "Sit down," she said without turning around. "The coffee is on." He sat. She had thought coming to this ranch that the job was to cook. She had thought that clearly and without much complication, because complication in expectations was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. You arrived at a place, you looked at what needed doing, and you did it. That was the whole of it. What she hadn't expected was that what needed doing would turn out to be larger than the kitchen, and that she would be willing to do it, and that the doing of it would change the shape of the place in ways that extended beyond the things she'd come to address. She hadn't expected the garden, or Price's survey notes, or the tin marker under the border stone, or Nathaniel Cross standing at a courtroom window while she sat on a bench and Pete handed her coffee, and the outcome of 2 months of careful work rested in a judge's hands. She hadn't expected to find, in a broken-down kitchen at the edge of someone else's land, something that felt like the place she'd been trying to get to for most of her adult life. That was the thing about arriving somewhere with almost nothing. You didn't have the weight of expectation telling you what the place was supposed to be. You arrived and you looked, and sometimes what you found was better than what you'd been looking for. There was a lesson in that, she thought. Not the kind of lesson that announced itself, but the quiet kind that settled in the bones over time. That the most durable things are not always the most visible ones. That a water agreement written by a dead man, a supplemental survey filed by a retired surveyor, a tin marker pressed into garden soil by a woman who'd been dead 5 years. These were the things that held when the storm came. Careful, unglamorous work done without an audience. The kind of work that didn't ask to be remembered but turned out to matter more than most things that did. She plated the evening's first course and put it on the table and called for Cord to let the men know supper was ready. Nathaniel was still at the kitchen table when the hands came through, and he stayed there while they ate, which was something he'd been doing more often, eating in the kitchen rather than the dining room, in the way of someone for whom the kitchen had become the more honest room. She ate standing, the way she always had, because sitting down to eat while the kitchen still needed attention had never come naturally to her, and probably never would. "Spring," Nathaniel said at some point in the evening, when the kitchen had quieted and she was doing the final cleaning. "What about it?" "The cattle on the north boundary are going to need supplemental grazing through February. I want to expand the upper pasture fence line to give them more range. It's something I should have done 2 years ago." "Who do you want on the fencing crew?" He told her. She noted it mentally, the way she noted everything. Not because it was her job to manage the ranch's operations, but because she'd learned that noting things was how you stayed ahead of them. Also, he said, there's the East Field. Pete thinks if we turn it properly in March, we could plant it this season rather than leaving it fallow another year. Pete's right, she said. I know he's right. I want to hear what you think. She wrung out the cloth she'd been using and hung it to dry and turned to look at him. This man who had spent 5 years in a quiet that wasn't peace and had come back from it. Not all the way. Not without the marks of where he'd been, but back in the ways that counted. I think, she said, that a field that's been fallow too long is ready to produce something if you give it the right conditions. She held his gaze for a moment. I think you should plant it. He was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the yard the way it did in December, steady and cold, testing the fences. The loose board on the barn had been fixed weeks ago. She'd finally told Cord about it, and he'd attended to it the next morning. And so there was no complaint from that quarter, just the clean sound of a structure that had been properly tended holding its ground against the pressure. That, too, was something. She turned off the lamp above the work table and left the one near the stove burning low, the way she always did in case someone needed the kitchen in the night. She'd done it since her first week, and she'd go on doing it. The small, consistent acts that a place ran on, the ones no one noticed until they stopped. Good night, she said to Nathaniel. Good night, Clara, he said. She went upstairs to her room above the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment before she turned in. The ranch was dark except for the lamp in the bunkhouse and the low glow from the kitchen below her, and beyond the buildings the land ran away into the darkness. Thousands of acres, the upper watershed, the West Fork where the creek divided and the boundary had been walked and recorded and defended and ultimately held. All of it still there, all of it standing. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window for a moment, and then she let go and turned away from it and went to sleep.